It's Aaron Bowman here. Going to give you another um, military demonstration presentation tonight, and we're going back a bit on the Second World War timeline. So this is we're talking about the Soviet counteroffensive, late 41, early 1942. So we've went through some of this before with the Battle of Moscow presentation, but of course, although the Wehrmacht's offensive had been stopped, of course, the German intelligence had estimated that the Soviet forces had no more reserves left and thus would be unable to stage a counteroffensive. Boys, how wrong they were, of course. This estimate proved wrong, as Stalin transferred over 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks, and over 1,500 aircraft from Siberia and the Far East after learning that Imperial Japan had no plans to invade the USSR, the Soviet Union, in the near future. And that's from Richard Sorge, who was a Soviet intelligence officer and was also a journalist of course. So he was interconnected, and they had found out from Richard Sorge. The Red Army had accumulated a 58 division reserve by early December, and when the offensive proposed by Zhukov and Vasilivsky was finally approved by Stalin, even with these new reserves, Soviet forces committed to the operation numbered only about 1.1 million, only slightly outnumbering the Wehrmacht in the area. Nevertheless, with careful troop deployment, a ratio of 2 to 1 was reached at some critical points. So we're just going to go a quick overview. Owing to bloody battles and stubborn resistance of the Soviet forces, the German offensive in November 41 had stopped. Of course, on December 5th and 6th, 1941, when it became clear that the enemy had exhausted itself, the Soviet armies launched a major counteroffensive. During the battles of Kalinin and Klinsko-Solnechnogorsk, Tula, Kaluga, and Ilitz, the Soviet forces took the lead from the beginning. Of course, on December 8th, Hitler signed the instruction to start the defensive operation at the entire Soviet-German front, including the Moscow sector. In the beginning of January 1942, the counteroffensive of the Soviet forces at the western sector was completed. The general headquarters decided to pass to the general offensive at all the main lines of advance, northwestern line, western, and south line, in order to defeat the main enemy alignments. So during Rozhetsk Vyazma operation, which took place in the period of January 8th to April 20th, 1942, which is roughly around where our timeline is. We're going from the first section of 1942 and a little bit back and forth in the timeline. And so April 20, 1942, and was meant to complete the defeat of the Center German Armies Group. The enemy was thrown back to for about 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. Completely liberated were Moscow, Tula, Ryazan regions. So 3 regions. Many parts of Kalinin, Smolensk, and Oral regions. Due to the insufficient experience of conducting the offensive operation of a large scale and the shortage of forces and means, especially mobile forces, the task of encirclement and defeat of the Center Armies Group was not accomplished in full. So they were still the Soviets were still learning how to do massive encirclements, massive movements like this, right? And so finally, they are starting to waken up. They are starting to get their feet warmed up for fighting the Germans, and the Germans are pushed back. And so this is another counteroffensive after we're seeing defeat after defeat after defeat in the summer of 41 and onward, with the Wehrmacht, and of course with Operation Barbarossa and the invasion in full. Finally, the Soviets are starting to get their butts in better gear. How, of course, however, in spite of In completion, the general offensive on the western line of advance it proved successful. So, I mean, three regions is still very successful. On April 20th, 1942, the High Command of the USSR decided that the West Sector forces should begin the defensive operation at the line of Rezov, Gazatsk, Kirov, and Zidzra. The Battle of Moscow was the first significant defeat of the German army during the Second World War on the ground. The enemy lost over 400,000 men. So, wow, 1,300 1.3 thousand tanks, okay, Panzers, um, and 2,500, sorry, 2,000, 2.5, sorry, 2.5 thousand guns, over 15,000 machines, and other equipment. It was also a psychological turning point for the soldiers and civil population. The faith in victory increased. The myth of the German army invincibility was debunked. The failure of the Blitzkrieg plan spread doubts of the successful outcome of the war among the military and political German leaders, as well as the ordinary Germans. For the model accomplishment of military tasks and the demonstrated courage, about 40 units and formations were conferred. The ranks of guards, 36,000 of the Soviet servicemen were awarded with orders and medals. 110 men were conferred the Hero of the Soviet Union. In 1944, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the Soviet Union, instituted the Medal for the Defense of Moscow. It was awarded to over 1 million defenders of the city. The Soviet counteroffensive during late 1941 to early 1942 was a pivotal moment for the Second World War, marking a significant shift in the Eastern Front and overall trajectory of the war. Its significance can be assessed through several key aspects, and that's breaking the momentum of Operation Barbarossa, which was something that was crucial. The Soviet winter, the temperatures, um, the freezing of and the lack of clothing material, heavy clothing material the Germans had, to yeah, losing the initiative in numerous ways. By late 41, the German invasion had made staggering advances, capturing vast territories and threatening Soviet cities, major Soviet cities, including Moscow. The Soviet counteroffensive, after they stopped the offensive, which was launched in December 41, halted the German advance on Moscow and pushed the German forces back to the city's outskirts. And then came the next pushback until April, which is 100 to 250 kilometers in some respects. Of course, this ended Germany's hopes of a quick victory in the east and marked their first major strategic defeat of this war. Of course, it boosted Soviet morale. I mean, the successful defense of Moscow and the subsequent counteroffensive were a major morale boost for Soviet troops, and it demonstrated that, of course, the Wehrmacht certainly wasn't invincible, nor were their tanks and their men, nor was their willpower. Um, they gained a lot of confidence, and of course, this was only the beginning of Soviet confidence and learning the abilities of encirclements and heavy pushes with mass amounts of infantry and armor. And so the winter conditions as well, and the vulnerabilities of the Germans with um, it really showed that the weak point on, of course, the war effort, in particular, lack of preparation for the harsh winter. German troops suffered in from inadequate supplies, and that's including winter clothing, but also logistical support, more fuel, more ammunition at some points, and certainly food. And while the Soviets were better equipped to operate in the freezing conditions, and that's their natural habitat. I mean, the strategic implications were there. The failure of the Germans to capture Moscow disrupted their plans for a swift conquest of the Soviet Union and forced the Germans into a protracted war of attrition. And they were ill prepared for this over this winter. The counteroffensive stretched German supply lines and overextended their forces, which had already been weakened by months of intense fighting. The setting, of course, for the future operations, while the counteroffensive did not result in a completely decisive victory, and we've talked about, this demonstrated the Red Army's capability to recover and then push back in large scale operations. The failure of the German offensive and the Soviet counterattacks in early 42 delayed German plans for a renewed push, setting the stage for future successes of the Soviet forces, including the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942. The Soviets are very far from being out of the woods yet. The Battle of Stalingrad is going to be the next, and it's going to be one of the key decisive battles of the Second World War, and where Soviet lines could collapse. I mean, this is certainly the Wehrmacht has still got a lot more push in it. Um, the impact of on the wider war, of course, the German failure on the Eastern Front in 41, 42 had ripple effects on other theaters of the war. I mean, it forced the Germans to divert resources and adjust their strategic focus, weakening their efforts elsewhere, such as North Africa and the Atlantic. So they had to bring forces out of um, whatever resources they had. They were focusing on certain areas in North Africa. They had to bring them up back into the Eastern Front. More forces being pulled out of operations in Africa, which they were still struggling at, and certainly in the north and from areas around the Atlantic Wall on against certainly it allowed the British to breathe easier, and of course, um, and that was in detriment to the Germans on that front certainly. And the overextended supply lines. I mean, logistical strain. By the time the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow, their supply lines were stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of occupied Soviet territory. Roads were in poor condition, and the rail network, which was critical for resupply, was insufficiently adapted to the German gauge. I mean, shortages. I mean, German troops faced severe shortages of food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. The Wehrmacht's advance had outpaced its ability to sustain itself logistically. Um, Soviet defensive preparations. I mean, stubborn defense of Moscow. Um, the Soviet forces invested heavily in the defense of Moscow. The city was fortified with trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and defensive belts. Civilians also contributed by building fortifications and assisting the war effort. Of course, everybody was involved. Everybody in the Soviet Union, even kids throwing Molotov cocktails on German tanks. I mean, it was a war um, it was the war of annihilation. The Germans called it, and of course, the Soviets had mobilized fresh reserves from the eastern regions of the country, all the way from Vladivostok and the other areas in the Urals to, you know, deep into other areas and deep into Siberia, including divisions relocated, of course, as I just mentioned, um, from the Caucasus, from everywhere. These troops were battle ready and well prepared for winter warfare. The reason why they did that, of course, they knew that the Japanese weren't going to attempt invasion. They were up on their heels in fighting the Americans, and their focus was there. Um, the strategic leadership, I mean, Soviet commanders, particularly General Georgy Zhukov, orchestrated a well coordinated defense and counteroffensive. Zhukov's leadership played a critical role in organizing effective counterattacks and managing reinforcements. The Germans were exhausted, of course. I mean, heavy casualties, over 400,000. They suffered significant losses during their rapid advance in the summer and in autumn of 41. This is certainly not like the invasion of Poland, and certainly not like even it was relatively easy, certainly easier compared to taking territory with taking territory such as Denmark and Holland and of course Norway, and it was relatively easy for the army there. And of course, even into France, it was relatively um, easier in losses, certainly, unfortunately, than it was in the east here. Um, yeah, I mean, not to say that they didn't lose thousands of troops, they did, but on this scale, it was much, much bigger. Um, Many units were under strength and fatigued after months of continuous combat. And of course, your exhaustion, your troops get exhausted, their combat effectiveness declines, and German troops were demoralized by their inability to capture Moscow in the harsh conditions, fatigue, dwindling resources, which further sapped their fighting spirit. Um, of course, the counteroffensive planning. I mean, the timing. Of course, they launched in December 41 and took the right time. It was time to coincide with the peak of German exhaustion and the harshest winter conditions which the Soviets could take. Um, and they took the initiative, catching the Germans off guard in some sectors. Some Soviet troops launched uh, attacks along a wide front, targeting vulnerable points in the German army. Um, Certainly, uses use of reserves. I mean, a deployment of fresh Soviet reserves gave the Red Army um, a numerical and physiological edge over the beleaguered German troops, and that's were even some of their best, the Wehrmacht's best units. You had men that were exhausted, wounded, and or dead, and losing so many of their comrades, fellow servicemen. They were demoralized, and that fatigue sets in. It does a lot of damage. So the intelligence behind this, I mean, um, strategic reserves, the Soviets strategically withheld significant forces in the interior, ensuring that fresh troops were available to counter the German advance. And that's hundreds of thousands of troops. Um, Intelligence base from information, the Soviet intelligence including information from Western allies, provided critical insights into German troop movements and intentions, enabling more effective planning. So the French, the free-fighting French from occupied France, and then the British and other and other occupied countries had troops that and forces that were certainly connected with the British in North Africa and teaching them about the movements of the Wehrmacht and how they could counter them, and that actually led to more effective planning as well. And Hitler's strategic missteps, I mean, refusal to retreat, I mean, Hitler's insistence on holding positions near Moscow at all costs had cost a lot of lives, preventing German commanders from executing tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions would have saved men, saved units, and this decision exposed German forces to encirclement and more heavy losses. And that's for certainly um, true in within the late Battle of Moscow, um, and this certainly was continued with Hitler's insistence in coming battles in 42 and 43. Focus on multiple objectives. I mean, the Germans had divided their forces earlier in the campaign, pursuing objectives in Leningrad and then, of course, in Ukraine. Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group North, Army Group South, uh, and the major prongs that we saw in earlier presentations. This dispersion of effort weakened their ability to concentrate on Moscow, and that's very true. And of course, Soviet successes in pushing German forces back from Moscow was the result of well coordinated counteroffensive that exploited these vulnerabilities. I mean, they had everything, and you can see here PPSH submachine guns, PTRS 41, anti material rifles, anti tank rifles, which were good for even for hitting German armor on from the underneath and in between turret positions and vulnerabilities with. And these are 14.5 millimeter, either semi-automatic or PTRD, which are bolt action single round um, anti-tank rifles. Um, this victory marked the first major German defeat on the Eastern Front, signaling that the Red Army could not only resist but also counterattack effectively. It was a turning point that set the stage for future counteroffensives. Um, So one of the main weapons you're seeing, with the Soviet army is something called Shapagin's machine pistol 41. It's a selective fire, open bolt blowback submachine gun that fires. It fires the Tokarov round. So the Tokarov is 7.62 tons 25. It's design. It was designed by Georgy Shupagin of the Soviet Union, and then of course it was an alternative. The PPD 40 um, was an alternative. This new system that you can see here in movies, the these are awesome. I mean, PPSH 41, mainly with Soviet troops, had a 71 round drum magazine. Used from 1941 onward to the 50s. Awesome, very rapid firing. There's roughly about 6 million made. Um, and these were, of course, these are amazing systems. I mean, the rate of fire is impressive alone. Up to 1,000 rounds per minute, muzzle velocity of 1,600 feet per second, and it shoots roughly 150 meters to 200 meters effective firing range. I mean, you either have a 35 round box, which you've seen even on here, or 71 round drum magazine, which you see here. I mean, these were used extensively on the Eastern Front and against the Germans, and they were feared by the Germans. And certainly used by um, they were certainly used by many Soviet soldiers, infantry commanders, and whatnot. I mean, of course, then that's alongside you have your TT-33 Tokarev pistol, and then many Soviet troops having of course, Mosin Nagant and 1891-30. These are, and then of course there's all different types carbines, 1944. But the Mosin Nagant was your standard bolt action rifle, basically the Soviet version of the Lee Enfield, or of course the Soviet version of the Kar 98. The Soviet equivalent of the Lee Enfield or the Kar 98 or the M1 Garand in some respects, but the M1 Garand was semi-automatic. This is bolt action. The Soviet equivalent of the M1 Garand more or less would be SVT-40, uh, which would be semi-automatic. And all of these weapons played a critical part in the war effort. I mean, going back to the objectives, primary goals of the January 1942 objective offensive were the encirclement and encircle and destroy German forces. So the Red Army aimed to envelop significant portions of the German Army Group Center, which had attacked Moscow, particularly near Ryaziev and Vyazma and Smolensk, liberating key areas. Soviet forces sought to reclaim strategic regions, including critical rail and supply hubs. And they relieved pressure on other fronts, from the southern front and the northern fronts around Leningrad. So they're relieving pressure from some of those. The success in the center sector would ease pressure from besieged cities, Leningrad, and of course in the southern operations in the Caucasus, which would be aiming towards Stalingrad and other areas through Ukraine, through Soviet Ukraine. So key areas of operation: um, Kaliningrad front northwest of Moscow, focused on disrupting German supply lines, threatening Ryazov and Vyazma. Western front, Moscow sector, targeting German forces retreating from Moscow, aiming to exploit their weakened state. Southwestern front, Ukraine, and south, launching offensives in the Kharkov and Donbass regions to weaken army groups south and regain lost territory, which is good because that had an effect. Um, some of their tactics, I mean, massive troop deployment, over a million Soviet troops, 1.1 million, supported by the 1,700 tanks, artillery, and aircraft, more thousands of those, participated in the offensive. You know, that's what T-34s, IS-2s, KV-1s, KV-2s, you know, as heavy tanks. And of course, winter warfare. Soviet forces used ski troops, partisan units, and winter adapted tactics to navigate snowy and forested terrain, which was awesome. Encirclement plans. The Red Army sought to cut off German forces by exploiting gaps in their defenses. And of course, the initial successes that the Red Army achieved some early victories during the January offensive. Territorial gains advanced in several sectors, you know, 100 to 250 kilometers, right, pushing the Germans back from key positions and reclaiming occupied territory. Disruption of German operations. The offensive forced German forces to abandon forward positions and redeploy the resources to stabilize their lines. Then, of course, there are challenges and limitations. I mean, despite initial gains, and the early 42 offensive faced significant obstacles, and that's the overextension of Soviet lines, which advanced very quickly, leading to overstretched supply lines, troops often lacking sufficient food and ammunition and winter clothing. Um, and the German resistance, of course, was significant enough to be noted that the Wehrmacht regrouped and established strong defensive positions, particularly at Ryazov, turning the area into a prolonged and bloody battlefield. Logistical difficulties, harsh winter conditions affected Soviet vehicles and supply chains, slowing their progress and reducing combat effectiveness. And four, command issues. I mean, Stalin's insistence on simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts diluted Soviet strength. And so Soviet lines were not as strong. We had to divide that 1.1 million through all these lines, leading to poorly coordinated attacks. And then, of course, the German countermeasures had to be taken into account. The German army, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and others, implemented a flexible defense strategy. They abandoned some forward positions but held critical strong points, such as Ryazov, which became known as the Ryazov meat grinder due to the intense fighting. And of course, German reinforcements and the better organized logistical system allowed them to stabilize the front in February of 1942. And the outcomes overall, the territorial gains, the Red Army pushed the Germans back in several areas, relieving pressure. However, the gains were limited compared to the ambitious objectives. They were still limited. It was a very good success, but not a total success that we talked about. And failure to encircle, I mean, the Soviets had failed to achieve the significant encirclement to destroy large German formations, and to that detriment, because they were stretched so far, they did have problems. Of course, these German formations reorganized and continued their attack in the spring of 42, in May and June of 42 and onward. And of course, Germans managed to maintain their front lines and even launched limited counteroffensives. But again, that of course would the Wehrmacht would be reconstituting, pushing forward in the summer offensive of 42. And of course, both sides suffered massive casualties, but the Red Army bore the brunt due to its aggressive tactics and logistical challenges. So they still lost tens of more than they still lost hundreds of thousands of troops in these offensives as well. And the stalemate, at Rise of the fighting near Rise of turned into a protracted and bloody battle that would last into 1943. And so, diverting significant Soviet resources, even to defend Stalingrad. And of course, the Germans pushed more forces from there into southern sectors for Stalingrad. But at least it uh, put attention from Army Group Center so that they wouldn't be able to push more troops and divert them to Stalingrad. But I mean, Army Group South was still um, going to be a major center offensive for Stalingrad, and it still would take the Soviets a long time to stop them and push them back with encirclements. I mean, the significance is there. I mean, um, the impact on the German offensives was profound enough. I mean, with Case Blue, the offensives forced the Germans into a defensive posture and delayed their plans for renewed summer offensives, which was Case Blue. And lessons learned by the Soviets, the Red Army recognized that the need for improved coordination, logistics, operational planning. These lessons would influence future operations such as the Battle of Stalingrad, which has certainly um, played a massive key role coming up. Symbolic victory. I mean, the offensive demonstrated that the Red Army could launch large scale operations, bolstering morale and undermining German confidence in a swift victory. And it took the Germans by surprise. Um, so you can see here one of the very common machine guns is the maximum. It's the PM M1910 um, Polyam Pulyamyot Maskima Maxima PM 1910. It's a heavy machine gun. It was used from the Imperial Russian Army in World War One, and of course with the Red Army and during the Russian Civil War, and all the way through to World War Two, and against the German offensive, with Operation Barbarossa. It was cartridge is 7.62 times 54R, which is it's a standard Soviet round, and that's exactly what the Mosin-Nagant used, and others SVT-40. A rate of fire is around 600 rounds a minute, and its main feed system is a 250 round belt. Um, so these are well used. I mean, um, they had different modernized versions. This is probably like the 1910-30, which is adopted by the Red Army, and of course, but in 1941 the gun was modernized again. Um, and in May 1942, an order was given to begin the development of a new machine gun to replace the Maxim, and that was the SG-43 Goryunov, um, and was adapted in the summer of 1943. And of course, these Maxim guns were replaced in Soviet service by SG-43s, but these were in service early in the war through 42 to 43 and on. A very effective system. So, concluding the Red Army's January 1942 offensive, um, it was bold enough and it really shook the confidence of the Germans. Um, it was overambitious ultimately. While it succeeded in pushing German forces back further away from Moscow and inflicted significant losses, it also exposed the limitations of Soviet logistics and command structure at this stage of the war. They're still very much in the learning curve, and this is their first test to being able to push the Germans back majorly. And it was successful, even though not overly completely. It marked a transitional period in the Eastern Front, where the Soviets began to shift from desperate defense to more consistent offensive operations, laying the groundwork for their eventual victory. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Aaron Boma, military historian for Carleton County. This is the next addition to the World War II timeline. Thank you very much.